Hello everyone, welcome to the talk. My name is Jiding Zhang, and I am an assistant professor of operations management at NYU Shanghai. Today, we are going to talk about, does fake news content create echo chambers? This is joint work with Nantil and Ken, both from Wharton. In recent years, a lot of concerns have been raised around the impact of misinformation. For example, in the article from The Atlantic, it is pointed out that we are disoriented, unable to speak the same language or recognize the same truth, and we are cut off from one another and from the past. One of the important causes is precisely the misinformation, and especially the prevalent misinformation on social media that we consume. It is believed that the social media and online news platforms may form echo chambers. Articles and contents that are pushed to us are similar to our view, and they are what we like. So we would have less opportunity to encounter contents that we don't agree with. We reinforce our views when we browse the social media platforms for these news items. Is this really the case? Does this concern hold? We are going to investigate these questions in this research. In this study, we emphasize the consumption of false news. How do people consume mainstream news and false news sources? Does false news content give rise to significant echo chambers that exclude mainstream news? We study this from the perspective of consumption decisions. We explore how people decide which source of news to browse, especially when policies that change people's exposure to false news are in place. Would that encourage or discourage mainstream news readership? That is indeed a causal question about interventions. We focus on identifying such causal effect of false news content on readers' overall diet of news. And finally, as researchers in operations, we are always caring about interventions, especially those that protect people from the harm of false news. We are interested in what operational policies are effective in containing this disinformation. We obtain a unique dataset on household-level web browsing behavior. It is a large dataset where more than 30,000 households who ever consume news in the United States participated. The dataset covers the span from January 1st, 2017 to December 31st, 2017. The dataset is a detailed one, and it is an individual level dataset. It allows us to study consumer heterogeneity for targeting. It has demographic information that provides insights to platforms to implement policies in an easier way, and it is a panel data that provides information not only on news consumption but also browsing behavior on other websites. All these great features facilitate our empirical strategy in this study. We want to study whether echo chambers of false news exist or not. We find that 23.3% of households in our dataset have ever consumed both sources. They are indeed 24% of the mainstream news readers and around 19% of the false news source readers. In other words, only around 10% of people who consume false news sources have never read mainstream news. This is relieving. Echo chamber effects do not seem to be very bad. And we have stronger evidence. We examine the level of fragmented readership of false news occurring among avid readers of false news sources and among light readers. Most avid false news sources readers who are at the highest risk of suffering from echo chamber effects are in fact more likely to also source information from mainstream news. On the other hand, although light readers source less information from mainstream news, they also receive very little news from false news sources. Such readership patterns suggest that echo chamber effects may not be strong. So far from the descriptives we know, echo chambers, if they exist, are shallow. However, we are more interested in the question that, does reading false news sources lead to echo chambers? We will use a unique natural experiment to reveal the causal effect of the false news content on individuals' overall diet of news consumption. In particular, the studied event exogenously reduces the accessibility of contents produced by false news sources, which enables us to observe the changes of mainstream news consumption levels made in response. In mid-August 2017, Facebook decided to block ads from pages that repeatedly share false news. As a result, Facebook page owners who wish to monetize their popularity are strongly incentivized to avoid sharing false news stories. This would reduce the platform's active supply of false news. So, the policy provides a supply-side shock to users' consumption of false news, and this is exogenous with respect to the user's demand preference. We know that the effect only changes the accessibility of false news sources for Facebook users. So, the non-Facebook users can serve as a control group. Their news consumption provides a benchmark on general news consumption trends. If, contrary to echo chamber effects, readers tend to balance out their consumption across different types of sources, then Facebook users would need to adjust their overall news consumption in reaction to accessing and reading less false news. In fact, Facebook users should react by cutting back on their mainstream news consumption. And this is exactly what they do from our dataset. The natural experiment on Facebook reveals the negative treatment effect of reducing false news supply on mainstream readership. So the blanket control policy has a downside. We further build a structural model on readers' consumption behavior and run policy simulations where we reduce false news supply to reduce false news consumption. But by targeting different people that we limit supply on, we evaluate which people should we target, such that we can reduce the echo chamber effects the most. Our candidate policy 1 targets the people who consume from false news sources the most. Actually, the current policies are oftentimes more similar to this one. Intervention is based on a single behavior and not the mix of behaviors. For example, the Facebook policy used in our study is based on repeatedly sharing false news rather than sharing more false news than true news. Similarly, WhatsApp has a policy of limiting shares on frequently forwarded messages. Again, it does not consider the sharing behavior of a mix of contents. Policy 2 targets on preference for crowding out. It does consider the mix of behaviors. To estimate people's preference for diversification, we need to take into account all the consumption bundles. And of course, with our model, we carefully control for confounders. It turns out that our policy 2 is more effective. Under our policy 2, there is a sharper reduction in the fraction of people who are in echo chambers. And why is that? Households with high false news consumption intensity are indeed those with strong preference for diversification. So, under policy 1, it is indeed targeting people who are immune from echo chambers, and this is of course less effective. So, we find that overall, echo chambers do not seem to be formed by false news consumption, and we see a strong tendency to balance mainstream news and false news sources readership. And we find that policies should focus on small fraction of consumers who diversify the least. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to any question.